Dear friends and students, this is Glimpses of World History by Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. Chapter 41. China Flourishes Under the Tangs. May 7th, 1932. I have told you of the Han Dynasty in China, and of the coming of Buddhism, and of the invention of printing, and the introduction of the examination system for choosing public officers. In the 3rd century after Christ, the Han dynasty ends, and the empire is divided up into 3 states. This period of division into the 3 kingdoms, as they are called, lasts for several hundred years, till China is reunited again and made into a powerful single state by a new dynasty called the Tang Dynasty. This was early in the 7th century. But even during this period of division, Chinese culture and art continued in spite of Tatar attacks from the north. We are told of large libraries and of fine paintings. India continued to export not only her fine cloth and other goods, but her thought and religion and art. Many Buddhist missionaries went to China from India, and they carried with them the traditions of Indian art. And it is possible that Indian artists and master craftsmen also went. The coming of Buddhism and of new ideas from India had a great effect on China. China, of course, was and had been a highly civilized country. It was not as if the religion or thought or art of India went to a backward country and took possession of it. In China, this had to come up against China's own ancient art and ways of thought. The result of the impact of these two was to produce something different from either, something with much of India in it, but still essentially Chinese, and molded according to the Chinese pattern. Thus, the coming of these thought currents from India gave an impetus and a kick to the artistic and mental life of China. In the same way, the message of Buddhism and of Indian art went farther east to Korea and Japan. And it is interesting to see how these countries were affected by it. Each country adapted it to suit its own particular genius. Thus, although Buddhism flourishes in China and Japan, it bears a different aspect in each country. And both these perhaps differ in many ways from the Buddhism that went out from India. Art also varies and changes with the skies and with the people. In India, we have now, as a people, forgotten art and beauty. Not only have we not produced anything of great beauty for long, but most of us have even forgotten how to appreciate the beautiful. How can beauty and art flourish in a country which is not free? They wither away in the darkness of subjection and restraint. But already, with the vision of freedom before us, our sense of beauty is slowly waking up. When freedom comes, you will see a great revival of art and beauty in this country. And I hope this will sweep away the ugliness of our homes and our cities and our lives. China and Japan have been more fortunate than India, and they have preserved still a great deal of their sense of beauty and artistry. As Buddhism spread in China, more and more Indian Buddhists and monks went there, and Chinese monks traveled to India and to other countries. I have told you of Fa Hien. You know also of Huen Tsang. Both of these came to India. There is a very interesting report of the journey of a Chinese monk named Hui Sheng across the eastern seas. He came to the capital of China in 499 AC and said that he had visited a land which he called Fusang, several thousand miles east of China. East of China and Japan, there is the Pacific Ocean, and it is possible that Hui Sheng had crossed this ocean. Perhaps he visited Mexico, for in Mexico there was even then an old civilization. Attracted by the spread of Buddhism in China, the head and patriarch of Indian Buddhism, whose name or title was Bodhidharma, sailed from South India for Canton in China. Perhaps the gradual weakening of Buddhism in India induced him to go. He was an old man when he went in 526 AC. With him and after him went many other monks to China. It is said that in one province of China alone, Luoyang, there were at this time more than 3,000 Indian monks and 10,000 Indian families. Buddhism had another period of revival in India soon after, and as the birthplace of the Buddha and the place where the sacred writings were, India continued to attract pious Buddhists. But the glory seems to have departed from Buddhism in India, and China now becomes the leading Buddhist country. The Tang dynasty was started by the emperor Cao Tzu in 618 AC. Not only did he unite the whole of China, but he spread his authority over an immense area, over Annam and Cambodia in the south, and right up to Persia and the Caspian Sea in the west. Part of Korea was also included in this mighty empire. The capital of the empire was Sihanoukville, a city which was famous in Eastern Asia for its splendor and culture. Embassies and commissions came to it from Japan and Southern Korea, which was still free, to study its arts, philosophy, and civilization. The Tang emperors encouraged foreign trade and foreign visitors. Special laws were made for the foreigners who settled or came to China, so that they might be judged according to their own customs wherever possible. We find especially the Arabs settling down in South China, near Canton, about 300 AC. This was before Islam came, that is, before the birth of the Prophet Muhammad. With the help of these Arabs, an overseas trade developed and was carried in Arab as well as Chinese ships. You will be surprised to learn that the census, that is, the counting of people in a country so that its population may be known, is a very old institution in China. As long ago as 156 AC, it is said that a census took place. This must have been during the time of the Huns. The counting used to be by families and not by individuals. Each family was roughly supposed to have 5 persons in it. According to this reckoning, China had a population of about 50 million in 156 AC. This is not a very accurate method, of course, but just remember that this census is quite a new thing in the West. I believe the first census was held in the United States of America about 150 years ago. In the early days of the Tangs, 2 other religions appeared in China: Christianity and Islam. Christianity was brought by a sect which had been declared heretic and driven away from the West. They were called Nestorians. I wrote to you some time ago of the disputes and fights between Christian sects. It was as a result of one of these disputes that the Nestorians were driven away by Rome. But they spread in China and Persia and in many other parts of Asia. They came to India also and had some success. But later, other branches of Christianity and Islam swallowed up the Nestorians, and there is little trace of them left. I was greatly surprised to find a small colony of them at a place in South India which we visited last year. Do you remember? Their bishop entertained us to tea. He was a delightful old man. It took some time for Christianity to reach China, but Islam came more swiftly. It came, indeed, a few years before the Nestorians and during the lifetime of its prophet. The Chinese emperor received both the embassies, Islamic and Nestorian, with courtesy and listened to what they had to say. He appreciated their views and showed favor impartially. The Arabs were permitted to build a mosque in Canton. This mosque still exists, although it is 1,300 years old, and is one of the oldest mosques in the world. So also the Tang emperor permitted the building of a Christian church and monastery. The contrast between this tolerant attitude and the intolerance of Europe in those days is very marked. It is said that the Arabs learnt the art of making paper from the Chinese and then taught it to Europe. In 751 AC, there was a battle in Turkestan in Central Asia between the Chinese and the Muslim Arabs. The Arabs made several Chinese prisoners, and these prisoners taught them how to make paper. The Tangs lasted for 300 years, till 907 AC. These 300 years are said by some to be China's greatest period, when there was not only a high level of culture, but a high level of general happiness for the people. Many things that the West got to know much later, the Chinese knew then. Paper I have already mentioned. Gunpowder was another. They were good engineers, and generally, in almost every particular, they were far in advance of Europe. If they were so far ahead, then why could they not keep ahead and lead Europe in science and discovery? But Europe gradually crept up to them, like a youth overtaking an elderly person, and was soon ahead, in some respects at any rate. Why this kind of thing happens in the history of nations is a most difficult question for philosophers to ponder over. As you are not yet a philosopher who will worry about this question, I need not worry either. The greatness of China during this period had naturally great influence over the rest of Asia, which looked up to China for guidance in art and civilization. India's star was not shining very brightly after the Gupta Empire ended. As usual, however, progress and civilization in China led to too much luxury and easy living. Then, there was corruption in the state, and this made heavy taxation necessary. And so, the people got fed up with the Tangs and put an end to their dynasty. Chapter 42. Chosen and Dai. Nippon, May 8, 1932. As we proceed with our story of the world, more and more countries will come into our ken. So we must now have a look at Korea and Japan, close neighbors of China and, in many ways, children of Chinese civilization. They are at the extreme end of Asia, the Far East, and beyond is the great Pacific Ocean. Till recent years, there was, of course, no contact with the American continent. So their sole contacts were with the great nation on the mainland, China. From China and through China, they got their religion and art and civilization. The debt of both Korea and Japan to China is tremendous, and something they owe also to India. But whatever of India they got was through China and colored by the Chinese spirit. Situated as they are, both Korea and Japan had little to do with big events in Asia or elsewhere. They were far from the center of things, and to some extent, they were fortunate, especially Japan. We might therefore almost ignore their history till recent times without any great difficulty. This would not make much difference to our understanding events in the rest of Asia. But we need not ignore it, just as we are not ignoring the past story of Malaysia and the Eastern Islands. Korea, poor little country, is almost forgotten today. Japan has swallowed her up and made her part of her empire. But Korea dreams still of freedom and struggles for independence. Japan is very much in evidence now, and the newspapers are full of her attacks on China. As I write, there is something like a war going on in Manchuria. So it would be well if we were to know something of the past of Korea and Japan, as this would help us to understand the present. The first thing to remember is their isolation for long periods. Japan, indeed, has a remarkable record of isolation and freedom from invasion. In the whole course of her history, there have been few attempts at invading her, and no success has attended them. All her troubles, till recently, have been her own internal troubles. For a period, Japan even cut herself off from the rest of the world completely. It was hardly possible for a Japanese to go out of the country, or for foreigners, even the Chinese, to enter it. This was done to protect themselves from foreigners from Europe and Christian missionaries. It was a dangerous and foolish thing to do, for it meant putting the whole nation in prison and cutting it off from all outside influences, good or bad. And then suddenly, Japan threw open her doors and her windows and rushed out to learn everything that Europe had to teach. And she learnt this with such right goodwill that within a generation or two, she had become outwardly like any European country, and had even copied all their bad habits. All this took place within the last 70 years or so. Korean history begins long after Chinese, and Japanese history begins long after Korean. I told you in one of my letters last year how a Chinese exile named Keatse, not approving of a change of dynasty in China, marched eastwards with 5,000 followers. He settled down in Korea, calling it Chosen, the land of the morning calm. This was in 1122 BC. Keatse brought with him Chinese arts and crafts, agriculture, and silk making. For over 900 years, Keatse's descendants ruled Chosen. Chinese immigrants used to come from time to time and settle down in Chosen, and thus there was fairly close contact with China. A big batch of Chinese came when Shi Huangdi was emperor in China. You will perhaps remember this Chinese emperor, who was a contemporary of Ashoka. He is the man who called himself First Emperor and had all the old books burnt. Driven away by Shi Huangdi's ruthless methods, many Chinese took refuge in Korea, driving away the feeble descendants of Keatse. After this, Chosen was divided up into several states for over 800 years. These states often quarreled with each other. Once one of these states asked China for help, a dangerous request to make. The help came, but it refused to go back. That is the way of powerful countries. China stayed on and added part of Chosen to her empire. Even the rest of Chosen, for some hundreds of years, acknowledged the suzerainty of the Tang emperors in China. It was in 935 AC that Chosen became a united, independent kingdom. Wang Qian was the man who succeeded in establishing this, and for 450 years, his successors managed to rule this kingdom. In 2 or 3 paragraphs, I have given you more than 2,000 years of Korean history. What is worth remembering is Korea's great debt to China. The art of writing came to Korea from China. For 1,000 years, they used the Chinese characters, which, you will remember, represent ideas and words and phrases, and not letters. Then they evolved out of this a special alphabet, more suitable to their own language. Buddhism came via China, and the Confucian philosophy also came from China. Artistic influences from India traveled through China to Korea and Japan. Korea produced beautiful works of art, especially of sculpture. Their architecture resembled the Chinese. Great progress was also made in shipbuilding. Indeed, at one time, the people of Korea had a powerful navy, with which they invaded Japan. Probably the ancestors of the present Japanese came from Korea or Chosen. Some of them may have come from the south, from Malaysia. As you know, the Japanese are a Mongolian race. There are still some people in Japan called the Ainus, who are supposed to be the original inhabitants of the country. These people are fair and rather hairy, quite different from the average Japanese. The Ainus have been driven to the northern part of the islands. We find that a certain Empress Jingo was head of the Yamato state about 200 AC. Yamato was the original name of Japan, or that part of it where these immigrants had settled. Note the name of this lady, Jingo. It is a curious coincidence that this should be the name of one of the earliest Japanese rulers. The word Jingo has come to have a definite meaning in English. It means a blustering and bumptious imperialist, or we might say just simply an imperialist. For every such person is bound to be, to some extent, blustering and bumptious. Japan is supposed to suffer also from this disease of imperialism or jingoism. And in recent years, she has misbehaved greatly towards Korea and China. So it is curious that Jingo should have been the name of her first historical ruler. Yamato kept up close relations with Korea, and it was through Korea that Chinese civilization reached Yamato. The Chinese written language also came about 400 AC through Korea. So also came Buddhism. In 552 AC, the ruler of Pakche, which was then one of the three kingdoms into which Korea was divided, sent to the ruler of Yamato a golden image of Buddha and Buddhist missionaries with their scriptures. The old religion of Japan was Shinto. This is a Chinese word meaning the way of the gods. It was a mixture of nature worship and ancestor worship. It did not trouble itself much with the future life or with mysteries and problems. It was the religion of a race of warriors. The Japanese, so near to the Chinese and so much in their debt for their civilization, are yet utterly different from the Chinese. The Chinese have been and are an essentially peaceful people. The whole of their civilization and philosophy of life is peaceful. The Japanese, on the other hand, have been and still are a fighting people. The chief virtue of a soldier is loyalty to his leader and to his comrade. This has been a virtue of the Japanese, and much of their strength is due to this. Shinto taught this virtue: honor the gods and be loyal to their descendants. And so Shinto has survived to this day in Japan and exists alongside with Buddhism. But is this a virtue? To be loyal to a comrade or to a cause is certainly a virtue. But Shinto and other religions have often tried to exploit our loyalties so as to benefit a group of people who rule over us. The worship of authority, that is what they have taught in Japan and in Rome and elsewhere. And you will see later how much harm this has done us. There was some conflict between the new Buddhism, when it came, and the old Shinto. But soon they settled down side by side. And so they have continued till now. Shinto is still the more popular of the two, and it is encouraged by the ruling classes because it teaches obedience and loyalty to them. Buddhism is a slightly more dangerous religion, for the founder himself was a rebel. The artistic history of Japan begins with Buddhism. Japan, or Yamato, began then to develop direct contacts with China. There were constant embassies to China, especially during the Tang period, when the new capital Xi'anfu was famous all over Eastern Asia. Indeed, the Japanese, or the people of Yamato, themselves established a new capital called Nara and tried to make this an exact copy of Xi'anfu. The Japanese always seem to have had an amazing capacity for copying and imitating others. Throughout Japanese history, one finds great families opposing each other and struggling for power. Elsewhere too, you will find this in the old days. In these families, the old clan idea persists. So Japanese history is the story chiefly of the rivalries of families. Their emperor, the Mikado, is supposed to be all-powerful, an autocrat and semi-divine, descended from the sun. Shinto and ancestor worship have helped to make the people accept the autocracy of the emperor and made them obedient to the powerful men of the land. But the emperor himself has very often in Japan been a puppet without any real power. The power and authority were with some great family or clan who were the kingmakers and made kings and emperors of their choice. The first great Japanese family that appears in history controlling the state was the Soga family. It was their adoption of Buddhism that made of this a court and official religion. One of their leaders, Shotoku Taishi, is one of the greatest men in Japanese history. He was a sincere Buddhist and an artist of great ability. He got his ideas from the Chinese Confucian classics and tried to build up the government on a moral foundation and not just force. Japan was then full of clans whose chiefs were almost independent and who fought each other and obeyed no authority. The emperor, in spite of his high-sounding title, was just a big clan chief. Shotoku Taishi set about changing this and making the central government strong. He made the various clan chiefs and nobles vassals or subordinates to the emperor. This was about 600 AC. But after Shotoku Taishi's death, the Soga family was driven away. A little later, another man very famous in Japanese history comes on the scene. His name was Nakatomi no Kamatari. He made all manner of changes in the government and copied many Chinese methods. But he did not imitate the examination system of appointing public officials, which was peculiar to China. The emperor now becomes something much more than a clan chief, and the central government becomes strong. It was during this period that Nara became the capital, but this was only for a short time. Kyoto was made capital in 794 AC, and for nearly 1,100 years it remained so, till it was displaced only a short while ago by Tokyo. Tokyo is a great big modern city, but it is Kyoto which tells us something of the soul of Japan, and which carries about her the memories of 1,000 years. Nakatomi no Kamatari became the founder of the Fujiwara family, which was to play a great role in Japanese history. For 200 years they ruled, making the emperors mere puppets and forcing them often to marry their womenfolk. Afraid of able men in other families, they forced them to enter monasteries. When the capital was at Nara, the Chinese emperor sent a message to the Japanese ruler addressing him as the Emperor of Tai Ni Pung Kok, which means Great Sunrise Kingdom. The Japanese rather liked this name. It sounded much more imposing than Yamato. So they began calling their country Dai Nippon, the land of the rising sun, and this is still their own name for Japan. The name Japan itself came in a curious way from Nippon. 600 years later, a great Italian traveler named Marco Polo visited China. He never went to Japan, but he wrote about it in his book of travels. He had heard the name Ni Pung Kok. He wrote this as Chipangu in his book, and from this came the word Japan. Have I told you, or do you know, how our country came to be called India and Hindustan? Both names come from the river Indus or Sindhu, which thus becomes the river of India. From Sindhu, the Greeks called our country Indos, and from this came India. Also from Sindhu, the Persians got Hindu, and from that came Hindustan. Chapter 43. Harsha Vardhana and Huen Tsang, May 11th, 1932. We shall go back to India again. The Huns have been defeated and driven back, but many remain in odd corners. The great Gupta dynasty fades away after Baladitya, and there are many kingdoms and states in northern India. In the south, Pulakeshin has established the Chalukyan Empire. Not far from Kanpur is the little town of Kannauj. Kanpur is now a big city, but an ugly one, with its factories and chimneys. And Kannauj is a modest place, hardly bigger than a village. But in the days of which I speak, Kannauj was a great capital, famous for its poets and artists and philosophers. And Kanpur was still unborn, and was to remain unborn for many hundreds of years. Kannauj is the modern name. The real name is Kanya Kubja, the hunchbacked girl. The story is that some ancient sage or rishi, made angry at a fancied slight, cursed the 100 daughters of a king and made them hunchbacked. And since then, the city where they lived was called the City of Hunchbacked Girls, Kanya Kubja. But we shall call it Kannauj for short. The Huns killed the Raja of Kannauj and made his wife Rajashri a prisoner. Thereupon, Rajashri's brother, Raja Vardhana, came to fight the Huns and rescue his sister. He defeated them but was treacherously killed. The younger brother, Harsha Vardhana, now went out to search for his sister, Rajashri. The poor girl had managed to escape to the mountains and, overcome by her sufferings, had decided to end her life. It is said that she was on the point of becoming a sati when Harsha found her and saved her from this. Having found and rescued his sister, the next thing Harsha did was to punish the petty Raja who had killed his brother treacherously. Not only did he punish him, but he succeeded in conquering the whole of northern India from sea to sea and up to the Vindhya mountains in the south. Beyond the Vindhyas was the Chalukyan Empire, and Harsha was stopped by this. Harsha Vardhana made Kannauj his capital. Being himself a poet and dramatist, he gathered round himself a host of poets and artists, and Kannauj became a famous city. Harsha was a keen Buddhist. Buddhism, as a separate faith, had weakened greatly in India. It was being swallowed up by the Brahmins. Harsha appears to have been the last great Buddhist sovereign in India. It was during Harsha's reign that our old friend Huen Tsang came to India, and the book of his travels that he wrote on his return tells us a lot about India and the countries of Central Asia which he crossed on his way to India. He was a pious Buddhist, and he came to visit the sacred places of Buddhism and to take with him the scriptures of the faith. Right across the desert of Gobi he came, visiting many a famous city on the way, Tashkent and Samarkand and Balkh and Khotan and Yarkand. All over India he travelled, perhaps even visiting Ceylon. His book is a strange and fascinating jumble of accurate observations of the countries he visited, wonderful character sketches of peoples in different parts of India, which seem true even today, fantastic stories which he heard, and numerous miracle stories of the Buddha and the Bodhisattvas. One of his delightful stories about the very wise man who went about with copper plates round his belly, I have already told you. Many years he spent in India, especially in the great university of Nalanda, which was not far from Patliputra. Nalanda, which was a monastery and university combined, is said to have had as many as 10,000 students and monks in residence. It was the great center of Buddhist learning, a rival to Benares, which was the stronghold of Brahman learning. I told you once that India was known of old as the land of the moon, Indu land. Huen Tsang also tells us about this and describes how suitable the name is. Apparently, even in Chinese, Intu is the name for the moon. So it is quite easy for you to adopt a Chinese name. Huen Tsang came to India in 629 AC. He was 26 years old when he started on his journey from China. An old Chinese record tells us that he was handsome and tall. His coloring was delicate, his eyes brilliant. His bearing was grave and majestic, and his features seemed to radiate charm and brightness. He had the majesty of the great waters that surround the earth, the serenity and brilliance of the lotus that rises from the midst of the waters. Alone in the saffron garb of the Buddhist bhikshu, he started on his mighty journey, even though the Chinese emperor had refused his permission. He crossed the Gobi Desert, barely surviving the ordeal, and reached the kingdom of Turfan, that stood on the very edge of this desert. A strange little oasis of culture was this desert kingdom. It is a dead place now, where archaeologists and antiquarians dig for old remains. But in the 7th century, when Huen Tsang passed through it, it was full of life and a high culture. And this culture was a remarkable combination of India, China, Persia, and even bits of Europe. Buddhism flourished, and Indian influence through Sanskrit was marked. And yet the ways of life were borrowed largely from China and Persia. Their language was not Mongolian, as one might expect, but Indo-European, resembling in many ways the Celtic languages of Europe. And, stranger still, on their frescoes in stone appear figures that are similar to European types. Very beautiful are these frescoes, with their Buddhas and Bodhisattvas and gods and goddesses. The goddesses often have Indian draperies of Grecian headdresses and draperies, presenting, so says the French critic Monsieur Grousset, the happiest combination of Hindu suppleness, Hellenic eloquence, and Chinese charm. Turfan still exists, and you can find it in the map, but it is a place of little importance. How wonderful it is that in the far-off 7th century, rich streams of culture should have flowed from distant regions to meet here and unite to form a harmonious synthesis. From Turfan, the pilgrim Huen Tsang went on to Kucha, yet another famous center of Central Asia then, with a rich and brilliant civilization, known especially for the fame of its musicians and the charm of its women. Its religion and art came from India. Iran contributed to its culture and to its merchandise, and its language was related to Sanskrit, Old Persian, Latin, and Celtic, another fascinating mixture. And so Huen Tsang traveled on through the lands of the Turks, from where the great Khan, who was a Buddhist, exercised dominion over the greater part of Central Asia, to Samarkand, which was already then an ancient city with memories of Alexander, who had passed by it nearly 1,000 years earlier, to Balkh, and then the valley of the Kabul River, and Kashmir and India. These were the early days of the Tang Dynasty in China, when Xi'anfu, their capital, was a center of art and learning, and China led the world in civilization. You must remember, therefore, that Huen Tsang came from this highly civilized country, and his standards of comparison must have been high. His testimony about Indian conditions is thus important and valuable. He praises the Indian people and the administration. With respect to the ordinary people, he says, although they are naturally light-minded, yet they are upright and honorable. In money matters, they are without craft, and in administering justice, they are considerate. They are not deceitful or treacherous in their conduct, and are faithful in their oaths and promises. In their rules of government, there is remarkable rectitude, whilst in their behavior, there is much gentleness and sweetness. With respect to criminals or rebels, these are few in number, and only occasionally troublesome. He further says, as the administration of the government is founded on benign principles, the executive is simple. People are not subject to forced labor. In this way, taxes on people are light, and the personal service required of them is moderate. Each one keeps his own worldly goods in peace, and all till the ground for their subsistence. Those who cultivate the royal estates pay a sixth part of the produce as tribute. The merchants who engage in commerce come and go in carrying out their transactions, and so on. Huen Tsang found that the education of the people was organized and began early. After the primer had been learnt, the boy or girl was supposed to begin the study of the 5 Shastras at the age of 7. Shastras are now supposed to mean purely religious books, but in those days they meant knowledge of all kinds. Thus, the 5 Shastras were 1. Grammar, 2. Science of arts and crafts, 3. Medicine, 4. Logic, 5. Philosophy. The study of these subjects went on in the universities and was usually completed at the age of 30. I suppose not very many people could go on up to that age. But it appears that primary education was comparatively widespread, as all the monks and priests were the teachers, and there was no lack of them. Huen Tsang was much struck by the love of learning of the Indian people, and right through his book he refers to this. Huen gives us a description of the great Kumbh Mela at Prayag. When you see this Mela again, think of Huen Tsang's visit to it 1300 years ago. And remember that even then it was an old Mela coming right down from the Vedic times. Compared to this ancient one, of hoary lineage, our city of Allahabad is but of yesterday. It was founded by Akbar less than 400 years ago. Far older was Prayag, but older still is that attraction which for thousands of years has drawn millions, year after year, to the meeting place of the Ganga and the Jumna. Huen Tsang tells us how Harsha, though a Buddhist, went to this typical Hindu festival. On his behalf, an imperial decree invited all the poor and needy of the 5 Indies to come and be his guests at the Mela. It was a brave invitation, even for an emperor. Needless to say, many came, and 100,000 are said to have fed daily as Harsha's guests. At this Mela, every 5 years, Harsha used to distribute all the surplus of his treasury. Gold, jewelry, silk, indeed everything he had. He even gave away his crown and rich clothing and took from his sister Rajashri a common garment which had already been worn. As a pious Buddhist, Harsha stopped the killing of animals for food. This was probably not objected to much by the Brahmins, as they had taken more and more to vegetarianism since Buddha's coming. There is a little tidbit of information in Huen's book which might interest you. He tells us that when a person fell ill in India, he immediately fasted for 7 days. Most people recovered during this fast. But if the illness continued, then they took medicine. Illness could not have been popular in those days, nor would doctors be much in demand. A striking feature of India in those days was the great deference and respect shown by rulers and military men to learned and cultured people. In India and in China, a deliberate attempt was made, and with great success, to give the place of honor to learning and culture, and not to brute force or riches. After spending many years in India, Huen Tsang journeyed back home, crossing again the northern mountains. He was nearly drowned in the Indus, and many of his valuable books were washed away. But still, he managed to take a large number of manuscripts, and the translation of these into Chinese kept him busy for many years. He was welcomed back with great warmth by the Tang emperor at Fu, and it was this emperor who made him write the account of his travels. Huen tells us of the Turks he met in Central Asia, this new tribe which in later years was to go west and upset many a kingdom. He tells us of Buddhist monasteries all over Central Asia. Indeed, Buddhist monasteries were to be found in Persia, Iraq or Mesopotamia, Khorasan, Mosul, right up to the frontiers of Syria. Of the Persian people, Huen tells us that they care not for learning, but give themselves entirely to works of art. All they make, the neighboring countries value very much. Wonderful travelers there were in those days. Even the journeys to the heart of Africa, or the North or South Pole, now seem feeble compared with the giant journeys of old. For years they moved on, across mountains and deserts, and cut off completely from all friends. Sometimes, perhaps, they felt a little homesick, but they are much too dignified to say so. One of these travelers, however, lets us have a glimpse into his mind as, standing in a distant land, he thought of home and hungered for it. His name was Sung Yun, and he came to India 100 years before Huen Tsang. He was in the mountain country in Gandhara, northwest of India. He tells us that the gentle breeze which fanned the air, the songs of the birds, the trees in their springtide beauty, the butterflies that fluttered over the numerous flowers, all this caused Sung Yun, as he gazed on this lovely scenery in a distant land, to revert to home thoughts. And so melancholy were his reflections that he brought on a severe attack of illness. Chapter 44. South India produces many kings and warriors and a great man. May 13th, 1932. King Harsha died in 648 AC. But even before his death, a little cloud appeared on the northwest frontier of India, in Baluchistan. A cloud which was the forerunner of a mighty storm that was breaking in Western Asia, Northern Africa, and Southern Europe. A new prophet had arisen in Arabia, and Muhammad was his name. And he had preached a new religion called Islam. Fired with zeal for their new faith, and full of confidence in themselves, the Arabs dashed across continents, conquering as they went. It was an amazing feat, and we must examine this new force which came into the world and made so much difference to it. But before we consider it, we must pay a visit to South India and try to make out what it was like in those days. The Muslim Arabs reached Baluchistan in Harsha's time, and soon after they took possession of Sindh. But there they stayed, and for another 300 years there was no further Muslim invasion of India. And when this invasion came, it was not the doing of the Arabs, but of some of the Central Asian tribes who became converted to Islam. So we go to the south. In the west and center, there is the Chalukyan kingdom, largely consisting of the Maharashtra country, with Badami as their capital. Huen Tsang praises the Maharashtrians and speaks highly of their courage. They are warlike and proud-spirited, grateful for favors and revengeful for wrongs. The Chalukyans had to hold Harsha in the north, the Pallavas in the south, and Kalinga, Orissa, in the east. They grew in power and spread from sea to sea, and then they were pushed away by the Rashtrakutas. And so, big empires and kingdoms flourished in the south, sometimes balancing each other, sometimes one of them growing and overshadowing the others. Under the Pandyan kings, Madura was a great center of culture, and poets and writers of the Tamil language gathered there. Most of the classics of Tamil date from the beginning of the Christian era. The Pallavas, whose capital was Kanchipura, the modern Konjivaram, also had their day of glory. They were largely responsible for the colonization of Malaysia. Later, the Chola Empire grew to power, and about the middle of the 9th century, it dominated the south. It was a sea power and had a big navy, with which it swept the Bay of Bengal and the Arabian Sea. Its chief port was Kaviripattinam at the mouth of the Kaveri River. Vijayalaya was their first great ruler. They went on spreading north till the Rashtrakutas suddenly defeated them. But they recovered soon under Rajaraja, who restored the Chola fortunes. This was near the end of the 10th century, just about the time when Muslim invasions were taking place in northern India. Rajaraja was, of course, little affected by what was happening in the far north, and he carried on his imperialist ventures. He conquered Ceylon, and the Cholas ruled there for 70 years. His son Rajendra was equally aggressive and warlike. He conquered southern Burma, taking his war elephants with him in his ships. He came to northern India also and defeated the king of Bengal. The Chola Empire thus became very extensive, the biggest since the days of the Guptas. But it did not last. Rajendra was a great warrior, but he appears to have been cruel, and he did nothing to win over the states he had conquered. He reigned from 1013 to 1044, and after his death, the Chola Empire broke up, many of the tributary states revolting. Apart from their success in war, the Cholas were long famous for their sea trade. Their fine cotton goods were much sought after, and their port, Kaviripattinam, was a busy place, with ships carrying merchandise coming from and going to distant places. There was a settlement of Yavanas or Greeks there. There is mention of the Cholas even in the Mahabharata. I have tried to tell you as briefly as possible about several hundred years of South Indian history. Probably this attempt at brevity will only confuse you. But we cannot afford to lose ourselves in the maze of different kingdoms and dynasties. We have the whole world to consider, and if a small part of it, even though it may be the part where we live, took up much of our time, we would never get on with the rest. But more important than the kings and their conquests is the cultural and artistic record of those times. Artistically, there are far more remains in the south than the north has to offer. Most of the northern monuments and buildings and sculptures were destroyed during the wars and Muslim invasions. In the south, they escaped even when the Muslims reached there. It is unfortunate that numerous beautiful monuments were destroyed in the north. The Muslims who came there, and remember, they were the Central Asians and not the Arabs, were full of zeal for their religion and wanted to destroy idols. But another reason for their destruction was perhaps the use of old temples as citadels and fighting places. Many of the temples in the south even now seem to resemble citadels where people can defend themselves if attacked. These temples thus served many purposes apart from that of worship. They were the village school, the village meeting place, panchayat ghar or parliament, and finally, if this became necessary, the village fort for defense against the enemy. Thus, all the life of the village revolved round the temple, and naturally, the people who must have bossed over everything were the temple priests and Brahmins. But the fact that temples were used sometimes as citadels may explain why the Muslim invaders destroyed them. Of this period, there is a beautiful temple at Tanjore, built by Rajaraja, the Chola ruler. At Badami, there are also fine temples. So also at Konjivaram. But the most wonderful of the temples we have of those days is the Kailasa temple of Ellora, a marvel carved out of the solid rock. This was begun in the second half of the 8th century. There are also beautiful pieces of sculpture in bronze, notably the famous Nataraja, Shiva's dance of life. Rajendra I, the Chola king, had remarkable irrigation works constructed at Cholapuram, an embankment of solid masonry 16 miles long. 100 years after these were made, an Arab traveler, Al-Baruni, visited them and he was amazed. He says of them, "Our people, when they see them, wonder at them and are unable to describe them, much less construct anything like them." I have mentioned in this letter the names of some kings and dynasties who lived their brief life of glory and then disappeared and were forgotten. But a more remarkable man arose in the south, destined to play a more vital part in India's life than all the kings and emperors. This young man is known as Shankaracharya. Probably he was born about the end of the 8th century. He seems to have been a person of amazing genius. He set about reviving Hinduism, or rather, a special intellectual kind of Hinduism called Shaivism, the worship of Shiva. He fought against Buddhism, fought with his intellect and arguments. He established an order of sannyasins open to all castes, like the Buddhist Sangha. He established 4 centers for this order of sannyasins, situated at the 4 corners of India: north, west, south, east. He traveled all over India, and wherever he went, he triumphed. He came to Benares as a conqueror, but a conqueror of the mind and in argument. Ultimately, he went to Kedarnath in the Himalayas, where the eternal snows begin, and he died there. And he was only 32, or maybe a little more, when he died. Shankaracharya's record is a remarkable one. Buddhism, which had been driven south from the north, now almost disappears from India. Hinduism, and the variety of it known as Shaivism, becomes dominant all over the country. The whole country is stirred up intellectually by Shankara's books and commentaries and arguments. Not only does he become the great leader of the Brahmin class, but he seems to catch the imagination of the masses. It is an unusual thing for a man to become a great leader chiefly because of his powerful intellect. and for such a person to impress himself on millions of people and on history. Great soldiers and conquerors seem to stand out in history. They become popular or are hated, and sometimes they mold history. Great religious leaders have moved millions and fired them with enthusiasm. But always this has been on the basis of faith. The emotions have been appealed to and have been touched. It is difficult for an appeal to the mind and to the intellect to go far. Most people, unfortunately, do not think. They feel and act according to their feelings. Yet Shankara's appeal was to the mind and intellect and to reason. It was not just the repetition of a dogma contained in an old book. Whether his argument was right or wrong is immaterial for the moment. What is interesting is his intellectual approach to religious problems, and even more so, the success he gained in spite of this method of approach. This gives us a glimpse into the mind of the ruling classes in those days. It may interest you to know that among Hindu philosophers, there was a man named Charvaka who preached atheism. That is, who said that there was no God. There are many people today, especially in Russia, who do not believe in God. We need not enter into that question here. But what is very interesting is the freedom of thought and writing in India in the olden days. There was what is known as freedom of conscience. This was not so in Europe till very recent times, and even now there are some disabilities. Another fact which Shankara's brief but strenuous life brings out is the cultural unity of India. Right through ancient history, this seems to have been acknowledged. Geographically, as you know, India is more or less of a unit. Politically, she has often been split up, though occasionally, as we have seen, she has almost been under one central authority. But right from the beginning, culturally she has been one, because she had the same background, the same traditions, the same religions, the same heroes and heroines, the same old mythology, the same learned language, Sanskrit, the same places of worship spread out all over the country, the same village panchayats, and the same ideology and polity. To the average Indian, the whole of India was a kind of Punya Bhumi, a holy land, while the rest of the world was largely peopled by mlechas and barbarians. Thus there rose a common Indian consciousness which triumphed over and partly ignored the political divisions of the country. Especially was this so as the village system of panchayat government continued, whatever the changes at the top might be. Shankara's choice of the four corners of India for his mats, or the headquarters of his order of sannyasins, shows how he regarded India as a cultural unit. And the great success which met his campaign all over the country in a very short time also shows how intellectual and cultural currents traveled rapidly from one end of the country to another. Shankara preached Saivism, and this spread especially in the south, where many of the old temples are Saiva temples. In the north, during Gupta times, there was a great revival of Vaishnavism and Krishna worship. The temples of these two branches of Hinduism are different. This letter has become long enough. But I have still to say much about the condition of India during these Middle Ages. That must wait till the next letter. Chapter 45, India in the Middle Ages. May 14th, 1932. You will remember my telling you of the Arthashastra, the book written by Chanakya or Kautilya, who was the chief minister of Chandragupta Maurya, the grandfather of Ashoka. In this book, we were told all manner of things about the people and methods of government of those days. It was almost as if a window were opened, which enables us to have a peep at India in the 4th century before Christ. Such books giving intimate details of administration are far more helpful than exaggerated accounts of kings and their conquests. We have another book which helps us a little to form an idea of India in the Middle Ages. This is the Nitsara of Shankaracharya. This is not so good or helpful as the Arthashastra, but with its help and that of some inscriptions and other accounts, we shall try to open a window into the 9th or 10th century after Christ. The Nitsara tells us that neither through color nor through ancestors can the spirit worthy of a Brahman be generated. Thus, according to it, caste division should not be by birth, but by capacity. Again, it says, in making official appointments work, character and merit were to be regarded, neither caste nor family. The king was not to act upon his own opinions, but upon the opinion of the majority of the people. Public opinion is more powerful than the king, as the rope made of many fibers is strong enough to drag a lion. These are all excellent maxims, good even today in theory. But as a matter of fact, they do not take us very far in practice. A man can rise by capacity and merit. But how is he to acquire the capacity and merit? A boy or a girl may be quite smart and may become a clever and efficient person if suitable education and training are given. But if no arrangements are made for the education or training, what is the poor boy or girl to do? In the same way, what is public opinion? Whose opinion is to count as the opinion of the public? Probably the writer of the Nitsara did not consider the large number of Shudra workers as entitled to give any opinion. They hardly counted. Public opinion was perhaps just the opinion of the upper and ruling classes. Still, it is interesting to notice that in Indian polity in the Middle Ages, as before, autocracy or the divine right of kings had no place. Then we are told of the King's Council of State and of the high officers in charge of public works and parks and forests, of the organization of town and village life, of bridges, ferries, rest houses, roads, and, most important for a town or village, drains. The village panchayat had full control over the affairs of the village, and the panchays were treated with great respect by the king's officers. It was the panchayat that distributed lands and collected taxes, and then paid the government tax on behalf of the village. There appears to have been a big panchayat or Mahasabha, which supervised the work of these panchayats and could interfere if there was need for it. These panchayats also had judicial powers and could act as judges and try people. Some old inscriptions from South India tell us how the members of the panchayats were elected, their qualifications and disqualifications. If any member did not render accounts of public funds, he was disqualified. Another very interesting rule seems to have been that near relatives of members were disqualified from office. How excellent if this could be enforced now in all our councils and assemblies and municipalities. There is mention of a woman's name as a member of a committee. So it appears that women could serve on these panchayats and their committees. Committees were formed out of the elected members of the panchayats, each committee lasting for a year. If a member misbehaved, he could be removed at once. This system of village self-government was the foundation of the Aryan polity. It was this that gave it strength. So jealous were the village assemblies of their liberties that it was laid down that no soldier was to enter a village except with a royal permit. The Nitisara says that when the subjects complain of an officer, the king should take the side not of his officers but of his subjects. And if a large number of people complain, the officer was to be dismissed. For, says the Nitisara, who does not get intoxicated by drinking of the vanity of office. Wise words which seem to apply especially to the crowds of officials who misbehave and misgovern us in this country today. In the larger towns, where there were many artisans and merchants, guilds were formed. Thus, there were craft guilds, banking corporations, and mercantile associations. There were, of course, religious organizations also. All these organizations had a great measure of control over their domestic affairs. The king was enjoined to tax people lightly, so as not to injure them or bear heavily on them. He was to levy taxes as a garland maker gathers flowers and leaves from the trees in the forest, not like a charcoal burner. Such is the fragmentary information that we can pick up about the Middle Ages in India. It is a little difficult to find out how far practice fitted in with the theory laid down in the books. It is easy enough to write of fine theories and ideals in books, but it is more difficult to live up to them. The books, however, help us to realize what the ideology or the ideas of the people were at the time, even though they may not have practiced them wholly. We find that the kings and rulers were far from being autocratic rulers. Their power was kept in check by elected panchayats. We find also that there was a fairly advanced system of self-government in the villages and towns, and that there was little interference with this by the central government. But when I talk of the ideology of the people, or self-government, what do I mean? The whole social structure in India was based on the caste system. In theory, this may not have been rigid, and may have been open to merit or capacity, as the Nitisara says. But in reality, this means very little. The ruling classes or castes were the Brahmins and Kshatriyas. Sometimes there was conflict between them for mastery. More often, they ruled jointly and accommodated each other. The others they kept down. Gradually, as trade and commerce increased, the merchant class became rich and important. And as it grew in importance, it was given certain privileges and freedom to arrange the domestic affairs of its guilds. But even then, it had no real share in the power of the state. As for the poor Shudras, they remained the bottom dogs right through. And even below them were others still. Occasionally, men from the lower castes made good. Shudras were even known to become kings. But this was a rare thing. A more frequent method of rising in the social scale was for a whole subcaste to go up a step. New tribes were often absorbed into Hinduism at the bottom. Slowly, they worked themselves up. You will see, therefore, that although there was no labor slavery in India as in the West, our whole social structure was one of gradations, one class over another. The millions at the bottom were exploited by and had to bear the weight of all those at the top. And the people at the top took care to perpetuate this system and to keep the power for themselves by not giving opportunities of education or training to these poor people at the bottom of the ladder. In the village panchayats, perhaps the peasantry had some say and could not be ignored. But it is highly likely that a few clever Brahmins dominated these panchayats also. The old Aryan polity seems to continue from the days when the Aryans came to India and came into touch with the Dravidians to the Middle Ages of which we are speaking. But there appears to be a progressive deterioration and weakening. Perhaps it was growing old, and perhaps the repeated incursions from outside gradually wore it down. It might interest you to know that India was great in mathematics in the old days. And among the great names is that of a woman, Leelavati. It is said that it was Leelavati and her father, Bhaskaracharya, and perhaps another man, Brahmagupta, who first evolved the decimal system. Algebra is also said to be of Indian origin. From India it went to Arabia and from there to Europe. The word algebra is from the Arabic. Dear friends and students, till now you were listening to the book Glimpses of World History by Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. Thank you for listening. Let us meet in a new episode. Till then, goodbye.